It's now my pleasure to introduce Harrison Rudolph of our Center on Privacy and Technology. He is a law fellow with us and published last night an article in Slate on how our nation's biometric exit system, repeatedly reauthorized to scan the faces of foreign nationals, is now being used to scan the faces of everyone, foreign nationals and American citizens alike. Harrison will be moderating our panel on tracking immigrant bodies, on the use of biometrics in immigrant surveillance. Harrison.
Thank you, Alvaro. Our topic is the tracking of the immigrant body. Journalist Ali Winston will be speaking with you about his reporting on gang databases and immigration enforcement. Nima Singuliani will be describing the ACLU's work fighting an illegal face recognition program in Vermont that was used to find visa overstays. Paramita Shah will be discussing the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyer Guild's work to uncover the rise of mobile biometric technologies that are being used to find undocumented immigrants in the field. Since the 9/11 attacks, every adult foreign national legally entering the United States has been scanned and measured by the federal government. That's because biometric tracking of foreign nationals was a key recommendation of the 9/11 Commission report. Biometric tracking of immigrants is now the law of the land. A set of 10 fingerprints and a face photograph has been collected and stored on every adult American immigrant who enters the country legally. Immigrants residing in the country are required to submit biometrics again every time they seek a benefit or a change in status, like a green card. This is true everywhere, nationwide. These data sets exist across different information systems. On their own, these data systems represent a complex array of information on millions of immigrants. But the interoperability of these data systems have transformed the federal government's ability immigrant bodies. So what does that mean if you're an American immigrant? What does it mean for you? It means that a police officer in Texas can stop you and pull up your identity and immigration status with a fingerprint, or maybe even a photograph. It means that the FBI's Face Services Unit can search your photograph against a face in a grainy crime surveillance video. It could even mean that someday a surveillance drone hovering around the US border will be searching for your face. Native-born Americans may feel immune to this dragnet, but they aren't. Surveilling immigrants has long paved the way for surveilling everyone. Biometric tracking of American citizens is coming soon to an airport near you. You may have seen something on the news about JetBlue or Delta offering face recognition boarding. It's already being rolled out on international flights at airports in Atlanta, Boston, New York, and even here in DC. Behind the scenes, the Delta or JetBlue kiosk is checking your immigration status or citizenship. And for Americans and immigrants alike, it's creating an exit record to show when you've left the country. While these systems differ in detail, they have two things in common. First, they're laying the groundwork for a much broader deployment of biometric tracking across the country. And second, they scan the faces of everyone, including American citizens. Treating U.S. citizens like foreign nationals contradicts years of congressional mandates. DHS has never consulted with the American public about whether Americans should be subject to face recognition. That's because Congress has never given Homeland Security permission to do it in the first place. Think of what could happen when airport face recognition gets it wrong. And they will. With an error rate that could be as high as 4% for the JetBlue system, and with countless people flying, false rejections will be a daily occurrence. When these systems make mistakes, will DHS subject you to secondary screening? Will you be taken to an interrogation room? Or will you be turned away? Behind the scenes, DHS is already handling your face recognition photo in ways many travelers would find alarming. For instance, After a JetBlue gate scans your face, your photo is temporarily stored in a system DHS uses to find terrorists. Look, while there's no smoking gun proving that DHS is comparing your face against a hot list of known or suspected terrorists, it's difficult to imagine DHS will resist pulling the trigger. People with foreign-sounding names have already struggled for years with false matches on the no-fly list. Will people with foreign-looking faces encounter the same discrimination? Unfortunately, comparing your face against a terrorist watch list may only be the beginning. Homeland Security is in internal negotiations to bring face recognition to the TSA security checkpoint. So what might mission creep look like? Imagine DHS deciding to search your face against state and local law enforcement databases. Would you be comfortable with your face being compared to the faces of wanted criminals simply because you flew home to see your parents? Imagine being investigated for a crime you didn't commit because while passing through the airport, an algorithm matched your face to a suspect in a grainy surveillance video. That data risks putting vulnerable people, immigrants and citizens alike, in danger. Thank you. Next, we have Allie Winston. Get you set up.
Is the red one?
No, the red one is the laser pointer.
Okay,
Yeah.
fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Harrison. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ali Winston. I'm a journalist with the Investigative Fund, which is a project of the Nation Institute. And for several years now, I have been studying I've been focusing on gang policing with the issue of gang databases. My research started in California, where the oldest gang database in the country exists and was created in 1997, but today I'm going to talk about ICE and their use of gang intelligence and biometrics. So ICE's gang operations, ICE as an agency was created after September 11th. It merged Immigration and Naturalization Services with U.S. and Customs Enforcement and greatly broadened the agency's ability to do criminal operations as well as civil immigration operations. And in the mid-2000s, ICE decided to really zero down and focus on gangs as part of something called Operation Community Shield. About a decade ago, in 2004, 2005, there was a real national, panic, one can almost call it, over Mara Salvatrucha MS-13 and 18th Street, which are two Central American gangs, largely composed of Central American nationals, Americans of Central American origin, which actually began in California, in Los Angeles, in inner city neighborhoods among Central American youth who fled there in the 80s, and then they spread to Central America when those same gang members or alleged gang members were deported by INS and LAPD and other agencies during massive sweeps. So the Homeland Security Investigation Section, which is a subunit of ICE, it's a really serious, quite large investigative agency, is in charge of Operation Community Shield, and they have a gang unit that's formed It's based down in Dallas, Texas, which is where the ICE gangs system is located. ICE gangs is the gang database that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement used until very recently. It is used to identify alleged gang members or associates who are a priority for deportation and have been since the mid-2000s at least. This is a constant through Republican and Democratic administrations. The Priority Enforcement Program, which was the Obama administration's attempt to focus on serious hardened criminals, actually includes a lot of people who are accused of being gang members, which is a category that does not require you to be convicted or even charged with a crime. These are the criteria for gang membership from ICE's own internal documentation, and they make clear that you can be accused of being a gang member if you fit two or more of the following criteria. If you have gang-tied tattoos, if you are frequenting an area known for gang association or presence, if you have been ID'd as a gang member or associate through an untested informant, or through a reliable source, both of those are in the language, or if you have been identified through electronic correspondence, been seen wearing gang clothing, or been documented through reasonable suspicion. which is not that high a standard. So gang intelligence for ICE comes from the information gathered by local police departments. They rely on information gathered by local agencies throughout the country to provide them with the raw intelligence to do gang policing. This includes arrest reports, intelligence briefings, field identification cards, which are filled out by cops during encounters as casual as a stop and frisk, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So CSRA is the contractor that ICE uses for this database. CSRA manufactured the CalGang database. They are a blue chip defense contractor. They make a lot of interesting web scraping tools and other IT products for the intelligence community and the Pentagon. And they have sold this database to a number of states, which you can see up there. Keep in mind that this is only the GangNet platform. It does not include places like Chicago and New York City, which have their own gang database format that I'm not really certain about. So through memoranda of understanding, ICE actually has the ability to access information in these state gang databases, which again, the criteria for gang membership and association is very similar to for state agencies as what I just showed you on the previous slide for federal agencies. And ICE does receive bulk dumps of data from state gang databases. I've written about this in some of my reporting. This is a example of a slide taken from CSRA's own documentation about what information is held in these gang databases. There are slots for any sort of information on your employer, your gang status, your citizenship status, if there's any records of you in ICE, your ethnicity, any tattoos you may have, and there's critically your mugshot. So these gang databases, the GangNet module that SRA makes is optimized for facial recognition. And mugshots are a critical part of a gang file. So people who do not have convictions, they're not charged with a crime, they have just been stopped and identified as an officer as a person of interest, as a person who has some tenuous connection, completely unverified, determined solely by a police officer as a gang associate. They're uploaded into this database, which is accessed by law enforcement throughout the country and immigration authorities. So the idea about gang status is critical in immigration proceedings because you do not have the same rights to challenge your gang status as you would in criminal court. You have no right to appointed counsel. You have no right to discovery. And those are critical elements in determining what evidence is behind the allegation against you. So I'm not going to go over the inaccuracies. That's pretty fair. But in California, the gang database is connected to Palantir, which is a data mining platform used by several law enforcement agencies, the intelligence community. In California, it's used by agencies like LAPD and the LA Sheriff's Department, as well as the State Department of Justice. In Los Angeles City, that data connects out to license plate reader data, criminal files, the National Fingerprint data, the National Fingerprint database, as well as the Next Generation ID system, which has 5-point biometrics on tens of millions of Americans. So I have been in FOIA litigation with DHS for the better part of 2 years now, a year and a half, 2 years, to get the raw data from the ICE Gangs database. And it has been a serious challenge, but at the same time, we are almost in the dark about how ICE uses their database, what sort of guidelines, privacy policies, what sort of restrictions are in place on searches by ICE agents for individuals accused of gang status, and I'm hoping that this litigation yields some tangible results. But either way, thank you for your time.
Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's in the afternoon, everyone's getting a little sleepy, but hopefully this presentation will liven things up. So, I'm here to really talk to you today about mobile biometric devices. And I wanted to, throughout the time here, point out the various, I think, organizing groups that have been leading the fight to really unveil what these devices have been doing in immigrant communities for a long, long time. So last year, my colleague, Julie Mao, we were working with some very amazing organizers, teachers, families from Durham, North Carolina, who were supporting some young people who had come as unaccompanied minors in January of last year. They were all detained. They were detained, some of them were detained on their way to school when they were arrested. They were called the North Carolina Six. Teachers and their families, the students, they mounted this really quite an awe-inspiring defense campaign that led to their release. And as part of the legal team at the National Immigration Project, we began reviewing some of these immigration documents, and what we found was a little disturbing. What we found was that one kid who had been arrested at his home had been basically arrested when ICE agents had come to their home, so they were looking for someone else, kind of asked to see who was in the room, poked their head through the door a little bit, didn't open the door, saw there were other people in the house, and pushed their way in. They made this young man sit with his brother and the other roommate in the house. They were shackled, and then, after they were shackled, ICE agents pulled out a device and they fingerprinted them. And then after they were fingerprinted, they decided to arrest one person, unshackled the others, and left. This is not an uncommon story. And in fact, organizations and organizers around the country have been hearing about this for a long time, most notably when it happened in 2013 in New Orleans, when there was a eye-opening report about the Criminal Alien Removal Initiative uncovered by the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice. Jacinta Gonzalez up there was one of the authors of that report. And as a result of that, we have seen more information about mobile biometrics coming down. And so what does it look like? The device actually looks like this. It's like the size of your iPhone. It's, it's made to be used at the site where they find you, whether it's at your home, whether it's on the street, whether it's in your car, whether it's anywhere. And it's now made to be interoperable with an iPad, with an iPhone, right? It's that small. And how much do they cost? Well, they cost about $2,500 a pop, right? So how many of these do they need? They aren't cheap, but they are now around. But the next part is, after they take your fingerprints, is what do they do with them? It goes to a database. And there are a number of databases that it goes to. We know certainly it goes to the FBI, which is standard, to get your rap sheet, right? And then it's run through IDENT, which is a Department of Homeland Security database. And then maybe, depending on where you are, it's going to be run through state or local fingerprinting databases. That's kind of how it works. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but really what this is kind of like how they actually get the hits. What are they looking for when they look at the rap sheet? And you may be thinking at this time, but they must know who they're going after when they wander into these spaces and start asking for fingerprints. Well, I think we know in this administration, there are no priorities. The prosecutorial discretion as we know it is gone. And so we should be looking at this time of mass arrest, really, not really a time of what is a target and who is not a target. I think what's changed a lot about these mobile fingerprinting devices is how you think about law enforcement. So when you think about law and order, you think, hey, somebody is going to come up to you with a warrant, or maybe they're in the midst of an emergency. Then there may be a detention, then an arrest, then you're brought to the station where you're booked and your fingerprints are usually taken. That really has been thrown out the window to some degree, right? Right now we see profiling, we see a sweep. We then see a demand for fingerprints at the site, and then maybe a decision about whether they're going to arrest. Where is probable cause now? It's not clear to me where probable cause is. It's not clear to me where constitutional safeguards exist. This is kind of where we are with the use of these devices. It is designed to interrupt and interfere with the way criminal processing is done and how we look at Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment procedure. So like I said, I think it's clear that when you take your fingerprints, even ICE admits that when you take your fingerprints, it's a seizure, right? But it's not clear when they're ever going to admit to a seizure. And of course, in most cases, they're going to say that when you provide the fingerprints, it's consensual, right? They obviously, when somebody approaches you with a police vest and a gun, obviously it's consensual. But I'm not only worried about the Fourth Amendment, right, which is search and seizure, or the Fifth Amendment, which is about your ability to be free, right, from a bad arrest to some degree. But I'm also worried about the First Amendment implications, right? Your right to freely assemble, your right to be together. What does it mean for day laborers standing at a corner? What does it mean for people who are grouped together, who are a different color? You know, people who may look suspicious because of the way they are dressed, because of the way they look. That is where I think we are heading in terms of those kind of constitutional violations. And it saddens me that we're going to have constitutional debates over those things. In terms of the systemic error, most DHS databases have always been shown to have a pretty high level of systemic error. We already heard about it here from Allie Winston. The old Secure Communities program had a 5% hit rate on U.S. citizens, designed to look at immigrants, often swept in U.S. citizens. And there are many instances where we have heard that people with status are picked up during these raids. Of course, it's no surprising to me that these errors will become more important. ICE, whenever there are organizations or community organizations fight, you can anticipate that the first thing they will say is, we don't do this. And they actually do often say, we don't conduct sweeps, we don't do checkpoints, we don't use these devices in this way. But these documents really show that they do. In fact, I think just a couple of months ago, they defended a request from us asking, don't you do these checkpoints in North Carolina? And the response is, we never do checkpoints. This is actually a document from the Atlanta Field Office Director, which has jurisdiction over the North Carolina office. And if you read how they conduct these checkpoints and what they're looking for and how they use mobile biometric devices, it's a real thing. They are doing it in conjunction with law enforcement. They are doing it on the street, and they are doing it just by stopping and deciding if they want to approach a group of people or not. So what does the future look like? I think everyone knows from this conference, we're going to have more collection, more interoperability, more boots on the ground, more beds. We're looking at a time of kind of unparalleled funding by Congress potentially into these kinds of systems. But I kind of want to take a step back and talk about what is the political moment that we're looking at. Interoperability is going to be a problem. The use of these devices is going to increase. But who is really using them is the Department of Homeland Security, which I think we need to look at as the largest federal police agency in the United States. It is tantamount to a national police force. It has more armed agents than the FBI or the DEA. And it is something that has not been reckoned with in this day and age. It is a young agency. It started in 2003, and it has enormous power. And until we start seeing it for the unregulated, unchecked agency that it is, it's going to be a problem. The last point I wanted to flag for you is that biometrics is a massive agency. And that a massive business. And whereas we used to be at $10 billion in 2015, we are now looking at a $52 billion industry in 2022, where fingerprinting devices will command most of that money. And for that reason, I know that legal options are an important piece of our puzzle in fighting back, but I wanted to point out these organizing groups that have really been leading the fight locally on against these programs and how they operate. Thank you. It's just that one, right? Okay, great, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I've already learned a lot just by listening to my two panelists. I'm now thoroughly scared and nervous about the future of biometrics and immigration. But I want to take some time to talk to you a little bit more about face recognition. We heard from Harrison earlier about federal efforts to expand face recognition in airports, in partnership with Delta and other airlines. But what I don't think that most people realize is many of the federal efforts around face recognition are being augmented by states and localities. And in many cases, these are the same exact states and localities that are now working on legislation and policies to try to shield their immigrant communities from the inhumane immigration practices that have existed for years, but are certainly intensifying in the current environment and the current administration. And so my hope is that if I leave you with one takeaway from this 6-minute talk, it is that if you are fighting on the ground or you are working at a state and local level to push back against these inhumane immigration practices, a piece of that puzzle has to be limiting how states and localities share information like biometrics, like data, like DMV information. Because if we're not getting a handle on that, we are not doing the best to protect the communities that I think we all want to protect. So just to give you a sense of this, what most people don't realize is right now there are today at least 15 states that share face information with the FBI. In many cases, they tap into one of the largest repositories where we all share our photograph, DMV databases, right? If we want to drive, we go to the DMV, they take our picture. In many cases, the FBI has partnered with states and localities not just to tap into criminal databases with mugshots, which in and of themselves are concerning, contain people who've never been convicted of a crime, but now are also working with them to tap into state DMV databases. And just to give you a sense of the numbers, the FBI, as many people have talked about, has databases with biometrics and photographs of immigrants and people around the United States. Their number of photographs is roughly 30 million. With augmentation from these states, they tap into an additional 230 million photographs through these partnerships. And it works in different ways. In some cases, it appears like the FBI may actually have access to these databases. In other cases, it's very typical for the FBI to go to a state agency and sort of submit a request, and that state agency will run a scan against its DMV databases and return, a collection of photographs to the FBI. Could be as many as 50 in some cases of potential matches. So what does this look like on the ground? After the wonderful Georgetown report on face recognition that was, and the way it was being used around the country, our Vermont affiliate, with a lot of support from Georgetown, tried to do some digging to say, what was actually happening on the ground? How does this translate into the types of requests that Vermont was receiving? And I think that the results were disturbing, to say the least. Like a lot of places, Vermont didn't really have a process for processing requests that were coming in. In other words, if the FBI said, hey, can you run this photograph? They wouldn't say, where's your warrant? Show me your cause. Why do you want to run this? What crime has this person committed? None of that was happening. The other piece that I think was also very concerning was that it appears from at least some of their data that it wasn't always criminal in purpose. When people talk about face recognition, you hear law enforcement, they say, well, we really needed to track down, the most serious of criminals. The reality is, though, from the information we got from Vermont, is that that was far from the truth. So in Vermont, they were receiving multiple requests from DHS and ICE, unclear the reasons behind those requests. They received a request to track a visa overstay. something that in and of itself is not a crime. They, in some cases, were asked to track people who had asked unusual and suspicious questions. Again, in and of itself, not something that's a crime. Information about a fugitive's girlfriend, so an individual who they knew actually hadn't taken a part in any criminal activity. And finally, there were also various, things that were categorized as criminal requests, but for which we have no sense of whether they were serious crimes, less serious crimes, or frankly, immigration offenses that we now know are increasingly being prosecuted in the new administration. And I think that one of the reasons this is so striking is that Vermont, like many of the other places who share this data with the federal government, at the same time that they're sharing driver's license face recognition data, is also having, passing policies and laws that in some respects are designed to limit cooperation with ICE. And some of this is being driven by concerns about law enforcement and trust with communities. Some of this is also being driven by concerns about trying to protect the immigrant communities from some of the really inhumane immigration enforcement practices that have continued. And so in some senses, there was a bit of a mismatch between what Vermont was doing with one hand and what Vermont was doing with the other hand. And I think that this type of mismatch was in Vermont a real opportunity, and is for all of us a real opportunity from an advocacy standpoint in the current environment. So what happened in Vermont? As a result, again, of the amazing work that Georgetown did in its report, one of the things that became clear in Vermont was there was kind of a quirk in the law, which is to say, Vermont wasn't supposed to be sharing and using biometric DMV information for law enforcement purposes. I think, to me, one of the lessons learned from this was how important it is to think forward, right? Vermont wasn't looking, when they had that law, at necessarily the technology that existed in that moment, but they were thinking down the line of how can biometrics be used in the future and what protections do we want to write in the law. So the first thing they were able to do is look at this law and say, look, what the government is doing and the arrangement they have with the FBI may not comport with state law. The second thing is that they were able to use FOIA and other means of actually just getting more information. I think the tough part when we're talking about these issues is, again, this wall of silence and these roadblocks we hit with the agencies in terms of figuring out what are they actually doing and what are they actually using with this technology. Because often what they say doesn't actually line up with the information we're getting. And then they were able to write to the Attorney General and highlight not just the privacy concerns for every single person in Vermont who has a driver's license. When you get a driver's license in Vermont, you don't sign up to have your face scanned at will for no reason and with no notice and few safeguards. So they were able to highlight the privacy concerns for the general population in Vermont, but they were also able to highlight the reality of face recognition, which is that the errors are not borne proportionally by all. We know from the analysis and the studies that certain communities, people of color, young people, et cetera, are more likely to have mismatches. And in that case, they're more likely to bear the brunt and the cause of errors. And finally, using all of this, they were able to write to the AG and advocate for halting the program wholesale. And there is some good news at the end of the story. They were able to receive a moratorium on the use of Vermont's face recognition system. I think that is a good initial success, and it's one that we should look at whether we can replicate, because I think around the country, we should be asking questions about, one, why are these systems operating? And two, why are they operating without the public input and without legislative approval and public and transparent policies? So with that, I'll look forward to your questions.
4 minutes from now. Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists.
Sorry, I stole this.
Thanks.
In the interest of time, I think we'll go directly to the audience and tee up 2 questions and try to get both of those answered. Right here, Mike, and one other question that we can tee up. Back there.
Hi, thank you. My name is Sajay. I'm a student at CU Law School. And I have a question, I think that would be great for this panel. So since 2012, the federal government has been in conversation to build a nationwide interoperable broadband network dedicated to public safety called FirstNet. And the agency in charge of this broadband network is FirstNet, right? I think the impetus was after 9/11, there was a lot of concern of like, how do we enhance public safety? How do we enhance communication between public safety and first responder agencies to better collaborate. So now we are in the process of developing a huge network that it's either each state decides how to build this broadband network or they adopt AT&T's plan to develop the network for them. AT&T does have a stake in this. I mean, they get to monetize the spectrum they use and the infrastructure they build and all that stuff. So my question to you guys is, have you thought about the implications of FirstNet in the surveillance of immigrants and communities of color? And if not, I encourage you to do so.
I apologize. Did I miss your name?
Ejael.
Ejael. Thank you very much. And I think we had one more question.
Hi, I'm Mary Madden. I'm a researcher at Data and Society. Thank you so much for this panel. It was excellent. Hello. My question was actually inspired by Ali's presentation on the gang member database, but I think it applies more broadly to all of the work that you're doing. I'm especially interested to hear if in any of the records requests, if you've been able to identify the extent to which a connection on social media is deemed as enough of a cause for suspicion, and talk a little bit about the implications there for freedom of association.
Great, thank you so much. Ali, it sounds like you want to...
Yeah, during my research, I've reported on social media monitoring programs, open source intelligence programs beforehand, and gang membership is very often determined through social media connections. A number of departments, NYPD, LAPD, Chicago PD, make use of social media mining data programs and link analysis programs, and oftentimes they're used to map out not only who is determined to be associated with a gang, but oftentimes when gangs are likely to be in conflict with one another based on the tone, the sentiment that is used in their communications back and forth with one another. So yeah, it's already being used.
Yeah, it is already being used, and in fact, the Department of State has confirmed this. The Department of Homeland Security has confirmed this, and we often see this come up in immigration cases, and it has, prompted us to actually create an advisory on how social media could be used against you, and how can you kind of put forward some best practices to somewhat insulate you from that.
I think one of the things that often gets lost in the conversation, but I think we really need to fight on, is it's not that accurate to use social media to try to figure out how someone thinks. I heard an example from someone who used to work at DHS, who now has expanded sort of looking at social media when it comes to vetting of various immigrants, was an example of an analyst who had looked at a Facebook post, and they had interpreted, liking a particular Facebook post to indicate support of certain terrorist activity, not understanding that the language that had been used in that person's local dialect suggested nothing of the sort, right? So it's not even just that, this is potentially an incredible waste of resources on a repository of information that has proven itself to be inaccurate, and for which we don't necessarily have government analysts that are attuned to differences when it comes to language and dialects and different, nationalities and communities.
And maybe one last point is like the threat from corporations in this is real, right? Like Facebook can turn over this information, right? And so I don't want to forget like the corporate partners to a lot of the law enforcement agencies that have been complicit for a good while and are expanding their involvement with law enforcement.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you again to our panel.
Yeah.